The air outside was heavy that evening, filled with the faint sound of bicycles rushing past, children shouting in the narrow lanes, and the smell of freshly cooked food rising from small homes that looked almost the same as each other. In one such modest neighborhood, a woman stood quietly near a rusted iron gate. Her sari was plain. Her face carried years of quiet struggle, and her eyes searched for something far beyond the dusty road in front of her. She was Sundar Pichai's mother. At that moment, she was waiting for her son to return from college. But the truth was, she was waiting for much more than that. She was waiting for a dream that seemed almost impossible. A dream so fragile that even breathing too heavily near it might break it apart. What happened next would go on to touch millions of hearts around the world. It all began years before that day, when Sundar was just a thin, quiet boy growing up in a small house that barely had enough space for 4 people to sit together. The house had no luxuries, no extra rooms, and very few possessions. Most of the family's life centered around one old fan that rattled when it spun, a tiny table that carried school books, and a single radio that his father listened to when he returned from work. But despite the simplicity, there was something in that home that was richer than anything money could ever buy. It was love, discipline, and the constant belief that one day, with hard work, a child from this very house could rise beyond all limits. Sundar's mother often told him stories late at night, even when she was tired from her daily chores. She would describe great leaders, scientists, and thinkers, but she would always end with the same message. What matters is not where you are born, but what you choose to become. Those words sank deep into Sundar's heart, shaping his sense of humility and respect. But at the same time, the weight of poverty hung heavily over his young shoulders. He knew his family had to measure every coin before spending it. He knew his parents sacrificed their own comfort to buy him school books. He knew he could never waste a single chance that life offered him. One of the most striking memories Sundar carried was of the telephone that came into their house when he was a boy. In those days, a phone was not something ordinary families had. When it finally arrived mounted on the wall, Sundar would watch in wonder as relatives and neighbors came just to make calls. He would memorize every number he heard. He didn't know it then, but this simple fascination with technology, with numbers, and with connections between people was planting seeds that would later grow into something the entire world would see. Still, as a child, he was just the boy who loved to listen quietly, who rarely raised his voice, and who respected his elders with all his heart. By the time Sundar reached college, life had become even harder. His father's income was small, and yet there were endless expenses. Sometimes the family had to choose between electricity and food, between comfort and survival. Sundar never complained. He simply studied harder. He believed if he could push through the long nights, if he could learn one more formula, solve one more problem, and understand one more concept, he could create a future not just for himself, but for everyone who had given up their comfort for him. He carried not just his own dream, but the dream of his parents, especially his mother, who silently prayed every morning before he left the house. And so we returned to that evening when his mother stood at the gate. She had heard whispers that Sundar's name was being spoken of by professors, that opportunities might be opening, that his talent was too great to stay hidden, but she also knew the cruel truth of life. Talent alone was never enough when money was short. She looked down at her worn-out sandals and wondered how far her son could really go in a world ruled by privilege and wealth. Just then, Sundar walked toward her, his thin frame carrying a bag filled with books that seemed almost heavier than his body, but his eyes were glowing with something she could not ignore. There was news. He had something to say. With a quiet voice, almost trembling, Sundar told his mother that he had been offered a chance to go abroad for higher studies. It was the kind of opportunity that only came once in a lifetime, the kind that could open doors no one in their family had ever imagined. His mother felt her knees weaken. For a few seconds, she could not even breathe. She knew what this meant. But she also knew the cost. The expenses for travel, fees, and living would be beyond anything their family could afford. She wanted to smile for her son, but tears filled her eyes. She turned away so he would not see them. That night, the family sat together in silence. His father spoke little, but his silence carried weight. He had worked all his life as an engineer in a small company, saving every coin he could. But even his savings were not enough for something like this. Sundar's mother looked at the floor, her heart torn between pride and fear. How could they let this chance go? And yet how could they possibly manage it? Sundar, sitting quietly, felt both hope and guilt rising in him. He wanted to fly, but he did not want to break the wings of the people who had raised him. Days passed, and the decision grew heavier. Some relatives advised against it, saying it was too risky, that the boy should settle for something safer, something closer to home. Others whispered cruel words, calling it foolish to dream so big when you come from so little. Sundar listened, but he never let anger rise in him. He respected every voice, every opinion, because that was his way. Yet deep inside, he knew he could not give up. Something inside him told him this was not just about him anymore. It was about proving that humility, hard work, and resilience could carry a person further than anyone imagined. Then came the day when Sundar's mother walked to the temple early in the morning. She stood outside the gate of the temple just as she had stood outside the gate of her house. She closed her eyes, folded her hands, and whispered a prayer that shook her whole being. She prayed not for wealth, not for comfort, but for strength. She prayed that if her son was meant to rise, the universe would open a path, even if it seemed impossible. And when she walked back home, something inside her had changed. She was no longer afraid. She was ready to stand by her son no matter what it took. Later that evening, Sundar returned from college again, tired but carrying a new piece of news. His professors were impressed with his work. Some of them were even willing to recommend him for scholarships. His mother listened with wide eyes, her heart racing. This was the crack of light they had been waiting for. But then Sundar paused, his voice breaking as he explained that even with scholarships, the money required was still more than they could handle. He looked at his mother, unsure if he should even continue speaking, and that was the moment she stood up, walked to the old wooden cupboard, and opened the small tin box where she kept her savings. It was filled with coins and a few notes, nothing compared to what was needed. But she placed it in front of him and said, "This is all I have, but you will not stop. You will go." Sundar could not hold back his tears. He had never seen his mother so firm, so determined. The weight of her sacrifice was heavier than anything he had ever carried. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter where life took him, no matter what heights he reached, he would never forget this night, this gesture, this love. He would carry it forever, like a flame that would guide him in the darkest times. The next weeks were filled with endless struggle. Papers had to be filled, money had to be arranged, documents had to be prepared. Every step felt like climbing a mountain. Sundar would stay up late into the night working on applications, reading and preparing, while his parents silently watched over him, their faces tired but filled with quiet hope. Neighbors whispered, some with jealousy, some with doubt. But Sundar ignored it all. He had no time for negativity. He only had time for effort, for resilience, and for faith in the values his parents had given him. Finally, the letter arrived. Sundar opened it with trembling hands. His mother stood nearby, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the neighbors could hear it. As he read the words, his lips parted, his eyes widened, and for a moment he could not even speak. Then, with tears streaming down his face, he whispered the news. He had been accepted. The dream was no longer just a dream. It was real. He would be leaving soon, stepping into a world none of them had ever seen. His mother could not stop her tears. She walked outside, stood once more at the gate, and looked at the sky. She thought of all the nights she had worried about the future, all the sacrifices, all the silent prayers, and now it was happening. But along with joy came fear. She wondered, would her son be safe in a foreign land? Would he remember his roots? Would the world treat him kindly, or would it try to break his spirit? The questions burned in her heart, but she said nothing. She knew she had to let him go. Love sometimes meant holding on, but sometimes it meant letting go. As the day of departure drew closer, the house grew quieter. Sundar packed what little he had, books, clothes, and the dreams of his entire family. His father remained stoic, speaking little, but his silence carried more emotion than words could express. His mother moved around the house, preparing food, folding clothes, wiping away tears when no one was looking. Sundar for the first time felt the weight of leaving. He had always been strong, calm, and focused, but now, standing at the edge of a new world, he felt fear creep into his heart. He was not afraid of hard work, but he was afraid of failing the people who had given him everything. The morning of his departure arrived. The family walked together to the gate, the same gate where his mother had stood countless times, waiting, hoping, praying. Neighbors gathered, some smiling, some whispering, all watching. Sundar hugged his mother tightly, feeling her trembling hands on his back. She whispered in his ear, "Go, my son, but never forget who you are." He nodded, unable to speak. Then he stepped away, his bag on his shoulder, his eyes filled with determination. Every step he took felt like tearing a piece of his heart away from home. And then, just as he reached the corner of the street, something happened that no one expected. His mother, who had always been calm, always been quiet, suddenly cried out his name. Sundar turned around, his heart pounding. The entire street fell silent. His mother stood at the gate, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she shouted, "Promise me you will never lose your kindness." Sundar's throat tightened. He raised his hand, his eyes locked with hers, and in that moment the world seemed to hold its breath. But what Sundar did next left everyone stunned, and it was something that people would talk about for years to come. The street was silent after Sundar raised his hand, a promise in his eyes, but what followed surprised everyone. Instead of simply nodding and leaving, Sundar did something different. He walked back, placed his bag down near the gate, and bent to touch his mother's feet right there in front of neighbors, friends, and strangers. In a culture where respect was sacred, the act was not unusual, yet the way he did it carried something far deeper. He was not just showing respect to his mother. He was making a vow to himself, to the people watching, and perhaps to the entire world, that kindness would never leave him. His mother's tears became heavier, but this time they carried pride, not fear. With that single act, Sundar turned and began walking again, but the image remained in everyone's heart. The boy who had grown up in the small house, who had carried his dreams silently, was now carrying the hopes of an entire community. Word spread quickly. People whispered that this quiet boy was going abroad, that he might become something extraordinary. Some spoke with envy, others with admiration, but everyone felt the same thing. They had witnessed something that was not ordinary. They had seen a seed of greatness being planted. The journey to the airport was filled with silence and heavy hearts. His father sat stiffly, his hands gripping his knees, his face unreadable, but inside him storms of pride and worry collided. His mother stared out of the bus window, clutching the edge of her sari as if holding on to it could somehow hold on to her son for a little longer. Sundar, sitting between them, looked at their faces again and again, memorizing every line, every wrinkle, every shade of emotion. He knew that once he left, life would never be the same again, for them or for him. When the time came to say goodbye at the airport, his mother's hands shook as she tried to adjust the collar of his shirt one last time. She whispered softly, "Eat on time, sleep on time, and don't forget your roots." Sundar nodded, unable to speak, afraid his voice would break. His father finally placed his hand on Sundar's shoulder and said, "Do not fear failure. Fear losing your values." Sundar looked into his father's eyes and felt a strength he had never known before. With a deep breath, he stepped forward toward the unknown. The flight was long, and Sundar sat by the window, staring at the clouds drifting below him. Every passing hour felt like moving further away from the only world he had known. The streets where he had played, the small house filled with warmth, the old fan rattling in the corner, all seemed like distant memories fading into the sky. But within him was a fire, built from years of resilience, humility, and the quiet sacrifices of his parents. He told himself again and again, "This is not just my journey. This is ours." Arriving in a foreign land was overwhelming. The air felt different. The people looked different. The language sounded sharp and the streets sparkled with lights he had never imagined. Sundar carried his modest bag, walking through the busy airport where everyone seemed in a hurry. He felt small, almost invisible, but he reminded himself of his mother's voice at the gate, reminding him never to lose kindness. He smiled politely at strangers, even when they ignored him. He carried respect in his heart even when no one knew his name. The first weeks were the hardest. The food was strange. The weather bit into his skin, and loneliness became his only companion at night. Sundar often lay awake in his tiny room, staring at the ceiling, missing the sound of his mother cooking in the kitchen, missing the quiet hum of his father's radio. Sometimes tears would roll down his face, but he would quickly wipe them away, whispering to himself, "I cannot break now." Every letter he received from home became his lifeline. His mother's words, written in careful handwriting, reminded him to stay strong, to study hard, and to keep faith. But struggles came faster than comfort. The classes were difficult, filled with students from privileged backgrounds who had access to resources Sundar could only dream of. Their confidence seemed unshakable, their clothes expensive, their voices loud. Sundar often sat quietly in the back, afraid that if he spoke his accent would draw laughter. He carried notebooks filled with scribbles, questions, and endless attempts to understand. There were nights he felt he did not belong. There were days he thought of giving up. But every time doubt rose, the image of his mother standing at the gate returned to him, her trembling voice asking him to never lose his kindness. And that reminder was enough to keep him going. One evening, as he worked late in the library, surrounded by towering shelves and silence, he noticed another student struggling with the same subject. She looked frustrated, ready to give up. Sundar hesitated, then gently leaned over and offered to help. At first, she seemed surprised that this quiet boy with a thick accent would try to explain, but as he patiently walked her through the concepts, she began to understand. Her eyes lit up and she whispered, "Thank you." In that moment, Sundar realized something powerful. Even in a foreign land where he felt small and unseen, his values could still shine. Respect, humility, and kindness could create bridges where nothing else could. Soon, word spread quietly among a few students. Sundar was not the loudest, not the most confident, but he was the one who helped without expecting anything in return. Slowly, he began to gain respect. Professors noticed his dedication, his sharp mind, and his quiet leadership. He was not just learning. He was becoming someone who lifted others while lifting himself. And yet, beneath the surface, the battle continued. Every success came with the fear of failing the family that had given him everything. Every achievement carried the weight of expectation. He often whispered into the night, "Am I enough? Will I ever be enough?" Then came a turning point. A professor, impressed by Sundar's work, recommended him for a special project. It was an opportunity that could shape his future, but it demanded long hours, sleepless nights, and courage beyond measure. Sundar accepted not because he felt ready, but because he could not let the chance slip away. As he worked tirelessly on the project, he remembered his father's words, "Do not fear failure. Fear losing your values." And so he poured himself into the work, not with arrogance, but with quiet determination. When the project was finally presented, Sundar stood in front of a room filled with professors, students, and experts. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, he remembered the promise he made at the gate. His words grew stronger, his ideas clearer, and his presence undeniable. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before it erupted into applause. Sundar stood frozen, his heart pounding, his eyes searching for something he could not find. The approving faces of his parents. He wished they could see him, hear him, know that he was slowly turning their sacrifices into reality. That night, as he walked back alone under the foreign sky, Sundar looked up at the stars. He whispered softly, "This is for you, Amma Appa." But just as he whispered those words, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from home. His mother's voice, trembling but filled with urgency, had left him a note that would change everything. The message from home reached Sundar late at night. He sat on the narrow bed in his small room, his books scattered around him, his eyes heavy from exhaustion. But when he saw his mother's name appear on the phone, his heart tightened. Her voice in the recording was soft yet urgent, trembling with an emotion he could not mistake. She said, "Sundar, we are proud of you, but something has happened and you must be strong." Then her voice cracked and the message ended abruptly. Sundar froze, staring at the screen, his mind racing. What had happened? Why did she sound so fragile? He tried calling back, but the line did not connect. The distance between him and home had never felt so unbearable. The next morning, he rushed to find an international calling booth. As the line rang endlessly, Sundar's palms sweated. Finally, his father's voice came through, steady but heavy. He said only a few words, but they were enough to shake Sundar to his core. His grandmother, the woman who had been like a second mother to him, had passed away. Sundar closed his eyes, the air leaving his chest. Images flooded back, her wrinkled hands caressing his hair, her gentle scolding when he forgot to eat, her quiet prayers whispered every evening. Now she was gone and he was thousands of miles away, powerless to even touch her feet one last time. For the first time since he had left home, Sundar felt broken. He sat in silence, unable to study, unable to move, unable to understand how life could be so cruel. Guilt gnawed at him. He asked himself again and again, was chasing dreams worth missing the final moments of someone he loved? Was success worth the pain of absence? But then, in the quiet hours of the night, he remembered his grandmother's last words before he left. She had held his hand and said, "Go, my child. Make your parents proud. Your journey is my blessing." Sundar wiped his tears, knowing that if she could see him now, she would not want him to stop. She would want him to keep moving forward. Days passed and Sundar buried himself in work, using pain as fuel. But something inside him had changed. He no longer worked just for success. He worked with a deeper sense of purpose. Every equation, every project, every late-night study session became a tribute to his family's sacrifices and to the memory of the grandmother who had believed in him. And yet loneliness still haunted him. Sometimes he would walk across the campus at night, watching other students laugh and talk freely while he carried his quiet grief alone. He missed the comforting presence of his mother, the guiding silence of his father, the warmth of home, but he endured because resilience had been planted in him long before he left. Then, one afternoon, while presenting another project, something unexpected happened. A senior professor, known for being strict and distant, called Sundar aside. At first, Sundar feared he had made a mistake, but the professor looked at him with rare softness and said, "Your humility is unusual here. Most students fight to show their brilliance, but you let your work speak. Never lose that. It will take you further than ambition ever will." Sundar bowed his head, his heart swelling. Those words echoed his mother's voice at the gate, and he realized the values he carried from home were not weaknesses. They were his greatest strength. Opportunities slowly began to multiply. Sundar was invited to join discussions, research groups, and even interviews for future jobs. But each opportunity also carried doubt. Could a boy from a modest house who grew up counting coins and waiting for one fan to cool the entire family truly stand among the best in the world? Sundar often stood before the mirror, searching his own eyes, asking silently, "Am I ready?" The answer never came from his reflection. It always came from the memory of his mother placing her savings before him and saying, "You will not stop. You will go." That memory pushed him beyond fear. Yet the world outside did not always welcome him kindly. There were moments when he faced prejudice, when people dismissed him for his accent, his appearance, or his quiet nature. He could feel the sting of being underestimated, of being seen as less. But instead of reacting with anger, he responded with patience. He reminded himself that kindness was not conditional. Respect was not optional. If others could not see his worth, he would let his work reveal it. He believed that no cruelty could erase the values planted in him. It was during one of these difficult days that Sundar received another letter from home. His mother had written about the daily struggles, the rising costs, the power cuts, the endless balancing of expenses. But between the lines of worry, there was a sentence that made him stop and read again. "We smile every day because we know you are working hard, and that is enough for us." Sundar pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes wet. He realized his family did not expect riches or fame from him. They only wanted him to stay true, to remain humble, and to never forget kindness. This realization lifted a heavy burden from his heart. He did not need to prove himself to the entire world. He only needed to live up to the faith of the people who loved him most. As seasons changed, Sundar began to grow into his place. His professors saw his brilliance. His classmates began to respect his quiet strength, and even strangers noticed the calmness with which he carried himself. Yet he never grew arrogant. He walked the same way, spoke the same way, and treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were a professor or a janitor. He knew that titles and positions were temporary, but character was eternal, and that belief made him different from many around him. But just when it seemed like Sundar was finally finding balance, another storm appeared. One evening, as he prepared for an important presentation that could shape his future, he received a call that shook him to the core. His father's voice came through, steady but heavy once again. There had been an accident back home. His mother had been injured. She was alive, but the situation was serious. Sundar felt his knees weaken, his breath shatter. The memories of her standing at the gate, of her trembling voice asking him never to lose kindness, flashed before his eyes. He could not imagine a world without her, yet he was far away, bound by commitments, responsibilities, and the very dreams she had pushed him to chase. He stood frozen in his room, torn between duty and love, between the path ahead and the home behind. The question burned inside him. Should he leave everything and return? Or should he trust that his mother, even in pain, would want him to keep moving forward? His heart pounded, his mind spiraled, and the silence of the room felt heavier than ever before. Sundar stood in the middle of his small room, his hands shaking as the words of his father echoed again and again. His mother had been injured. The thought pierced him deeper than anything he had faced since leaving home. He had always drawn his strength from her voice, her sacrifices, her unwavering faith. Now she was the one who needed strength, and he was far away, separated by oceans, responsibilities, and the fragile thread of ambition. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to hold back tears, but they flowed freely. His heart pulled him toward home, while his mind reminded him of the path she had asked him to follow. It was a battle no dreamer wants to face, the fight between love and duty. As he tried to gather his breath, Sundar remembered the night before he left when his mother had pressed her savings into his hands and told him not to stop. He realized that if he abandoned his studies now, she would never forgive herself. She would believe she had caused him to give up everything. Yet at the same time, he felt the ache of absence, the guilt of not being by her side. Every second felt like betrayal, as if he was choosing his future over his family. He whispered into the stillness of the room, "Amma, what do you want me to do?" But no answer came. Only silence heavy enough to crush him. The next morning, Sundar dragged himself to the library, but the words on the pages blurred before his eyes. His mind wandered endlessly. Was she in pain? Was she asking for him? Was she even conscious? Every ring of his phone made his heart jump. Finally, a letter arrived a few days later. His mother had written it before the accident, and it reached him by chance. In the letter, she told him to focus on his studies, to remember that resilience was born in their family and that he carried not just his dream, but theirs as well. Reading those words, Sundar broke down completely. It was as if she had spoken to him across time, telling him to keep moving even while she suffered. He pressed the letter to his chest, whispering, "I will not fail you." Though pain lingered, Sundar threw himself into his work with renewed fire. He knew that the best way to honor his mother was to keep going, to show her that her sacrifices had not been wasted. Still, every night he sat by the window, staring at the stars, wondering if she was looking at the same sky, praying for him just as he prayed for her. In those quiet hours, he promised himself that when the day came, he would return to her not as the boy who left, but as the man she had believed he could become. Weeks passed, and slowly news arrived that his mother was recovering. Relief washed over Sundar like rain on parched earth. He closed his eyes, thanking the universe for sparing her. The knowledge that she was healing gave him the strength to continue. His professors noticed his focus sharpen. His classmates saw a quiet determination in his eyes, and soon he was given responsibilities that only the most trusted students received. Yet through all the progress, Sundar never lost his humility. When praised, he bowed his head. When offered help, he accepted with gratitude. He carried his roots with him in every step. But life is never smooth for long. Just as Sundar began to find balance, another challenge rose before him. The opportunity of a lifetime appeared, an interview for a position that could change his future completely. It was the kind of chance that only came once, the kind that could open doors to worlds even bigger than he had imagined. But the timing was cruel. The interview was scheduled on the very same day his mother was finally able to speak to him live after weeks of silence. He knew she would be waiting for his call, longing to hear his voice after her recovery. Torn once again, Sundar faced another choice. Honor the interview that could shape his future, or speak to his mother when her heart most needed him. He walked the campus for hours, the decision burning inside him. Some would say the answer was obvious. Seize the opportunity, for family could wait. Others would say no dream was worth delaying a mother's voice. But Sundar's heart was split in two. He knew his mother's love was unconditional, yet he also knew she had sent him away to chase greatness. As the day approached, the weight of the choice became unbearable. He stood in front of the mirror once more, searching his reflection, whispering, "What will honor her more? My presence on the call, or my presence in the future?" The question echoed in his mind louder and louder until he felt his chest tighten. The day arrived, and Sundar stood at the crossroads of his destiny. His phone lay on the table, ready to connect him to the voice he longed to hear, while the papers for his interview rested on his desk, demanding his focus. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he stared at both. His heart raced, his breath grew shallow, and he felt the world spinning faster than he could hold on to. In that moment, he realized that whatever choice he made, it would leave a mark forever. And just as the clock struck, Sundar reached out. Sundar's hand hovered in the air, caught between the phone and the papers on his desk. Every second felt like a lifetime. He could almost hear his mother's voice calling to him from across the oceans, fragile yet filled with love. At the same time, the weight of the interview pressed heavily against him, a reminder that this opportunity might never come again. He closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, and he whispered to himself, "Amma, guide me." Then, with a sudden clarity, he reached for the interview papers, not because he loved his mother any less, but because he understood her heart. She had not sent him away to choose comfort over duty. She had sent him to build something that would one day make every sacrifice worth it. The interview was intense, filled with sharp questions and piercing eyes. Sundar's voice trembled at first, but as he remembered his father's words, "Do not fear failure, fear losing your values," his tone grew steadier. He answered with honesty, not arrogance, with humility, not pride. He spoke not as someone desperate to prove himself, but as someone who carried the quiet strength of a family's faith. By the time he finished, the room was silent. One of the interviewers leaned back, studying him carefully, and finally said, "You are different. Not loud, not boastful, but there is something unshakable about you." Sundar bowed his head slightly, whispering a simple, "Thank you." Inside, he felt the warmth of his mother's blessing. After the interview ended, Sundar rushed back to his room, his heart pounding. He grabbed the phone and dialed home, praying that his mother would answer. When her voice finally came through, weak but steady, Sundar's eyes filled with tears. She said, "My son, I waited to hear you. Did you do well?" Sundar could barely speak, his throat tightening as he whispered, "I did my best, Amma." Her soft laugh, fragile yet filled with relief, carried across the line. "Then I am healed," she said, and those words sank into Sundar's soul like medicine for his wounds. In that moment, he understood something powerful. His journey was not just about achievements, but about carrying his family's love with him into every step. Days later, the results arrived. Sundar had succeeded. He was offered the position that would shape his future and open paths that once seemed unreachable. But instead of celebrating with loud cheers or pride, Sundar sat quietly with the letter in his hand. He thought of his small home, of his mother standing at the gate, of his father's silent strength, of his grandmother's blessing. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he whispered, "This is for you, not for me." He realized that every door opening before him was built on the foundation of sacrifice, humility, and resilience, and he promised himself once again that he would never forget his roots. As months turned into years, Sundar's journey continued to rise. He moved through challenges, faced setbacks, and embraced opportunities with the same quiet determination. Wherever he went, he carried the same respect for others, whether they were professors, colleagues, or strangers. His humility became his signature, his kindness, his shield. People began to notice not just his brilliance, but the way he treated others, with dignity, patience, and genuine care. Slowly, the boy who once sat silently at the back of classrooms became the man others looked up to, not because he demanded attention, but because he inspired it naturally. Yet success brought new pressures. Expectations grew heavier, responsibilities multiplied, and eyes from around the world began to watch him. Sometimes, in the silence of his office, Sundar would feel the same weight he had felt in his small room years ago, torn between choices, burdened by doubt. But whenever he felt close to breaking, he returned in his mind to the image of his mother, at the gate, her trembling voice calling out, "Promise me you will never lose your kindness." That memory became his anchor, reminding him that true greatness was not measured by titles or wealth, but by how one remained human in the face of power. Then came the moment that would bring his journey full circle. Sundar was invited to take a role so large, so historic, that it would place him at the heart of technology shaping the world. It was the kind of position that could turn a quiet boy from a modest home into a leader recognized by millions. When the news reached home, his mother stood once again at the gate, this time not waiting for him to return, but overwhelmed by the knowledge of how far he had gone. Neighbors gathered, whispering in awe, remembering the day the boy had left with nothing but a bag of books and a heart full of hope. Now he was a symbol of what resilience, humility, and kindness could achieve. But just when it seemed as though the story had reached its highest point, another twist appeared, one that no one had expected. For even as Sundar prepared to step into this new role, a decision lay before him, one that could change not only his life, but the lives of countless others. It was not about success or failure this time, but about choosing between two paths that carried equal weight, the path of ambition and the path of humanity. As he stood on the edge of this choice, the world around him seemed to pause, waiting to see what he would do. The world held its breath as Sundar stood on the edge of his greatest decision. The role offered to him was historic, the kind of position that could shape the future of technology and touch billions of lives. Yet it was not just a title or a job. It was a burden of responsibility, a path that could either elevate humanity or lose sight of it in the noise of ambition. Sundar sat alone in his room the night before the announcement, staring at the ceiling, feeling the same heaviness he had felt as a boy before leaving home. He knew that whatever he chose, people would talk, people would judge, but deep in his heart, he remembered the words that had followed him through every storm. "Promise me you will never lose your kindness." The next morning, crowds gathered in front of his modest home back in India. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts now stood with admiration, waiting for news of the boy who had left with nothing but hope. Inside the house, his mother moved slowly, her health fragile but her spirit strong. She had aged since the day she stood at the gate years ago, watching her son walk away, yet her eyes still carried the same light, the same faith. When the news came that her son had been chosen to lead one of the most powerful companies in the world, she did not smile in pride the way others expected. Instead, she quietly walked outside and stood at the same old gate, her heart pounding as if waiting once more for her boy to return. And then, it happened. As the cameras flashed, as the world watched screens filled with his image, Sundar made a move that no one expected. Before speaking about power, before speaking about technology, he spoke about his mother. His voice, steady yet filled with emotion, carried across the room and into the hearts of millions. He said, "The woman who waited outside the gate for me, who gave me courage when I had nothing, is the reason I stand here today. This success is not mine, it is hers." He paused, his eyes glistening, and added, "I promised her I would never lose my kindness, and today I renew that promise before the world." As those words spread across screens, the camera captured a simple scene thousands of miles away. His mother standing outside the gate of their small house, tears streaming down her face. Neighbors fell silent. Strangers watching from around the world felt their own eyes fill with tears. It was not the story of power, wealth, or fame that moved them. It was the story of a mother's love, a son's humility, and the unshakable truth that greatness begins with respect and kindness. In that moment, Sundar was no longer just a leader of a company. He became a symbol of resilience, of never forgetting where you come from, and of honoring the sacrifices that make dreams possible. After the speech, when Sundar finally returned home for a visit, the scene was as simple as it was unforgettable. His car stopped at the corner, cameras flashing, people cheering, but Sundar ignored it all. He walked past the crowd, past the noise, until he reached the same rusted gate where his mother stood waiting. She was frail, her hands trembling, but her eyes were steady. Without a word, Sundar dropped his bag, bent down and touched her feet once again, just as he had the day he left. This time the whole world was watching, and the whole world wept, for they saw not just a successful man, but a son who had never forgotten his promise. His mother placed her hand on his head, whispering softly, "You kept your word, my child." Sundar closed his eyes, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. He knew then that every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, every sleepless night had been worth it, not because he had achieved power, but because he had remained true to the values that mattered most. The gate that once symbolized departure now symbolized return, not just of a son to his mother, but of a man to his roots. And so the story of Sundar Pichai became more than the story of a career or a company. It became a story told in homes, whispered in classrooms, shared in villages and cities alike, a story of how respect, humility, resilience, and kindness could carry a boy from a small house with one rattling fan to the very top of the world. A story of how a mother's tears could turn into the pride of millions. A story that reminded everyone watching that true greatness is not in the titles we hold, but in the love we carry, the kindness we keep, and the promises we never break.